Before we get into the video, could everyone please subscribe to my HOA Karen Tales channel? Thank you so much. A shrill voice pierced the calm, suburban air. I'm calling 911. This is illegal. Karen, the self-proclaimed queen of the HOA, stood at the edge of my property, her face red with fury, her phone already pressed to her ear. I didn't flinch. The rhythmic thump, thump, thump of rotor blades grew louder as my helicopter descended onto the landing pad I had installed just a few weeks ago. The wind from the downdraft whipped through her carefully styled hair, sending a few loose strands flying. I smirked. "Go ahead, Karen," I said, my voice calm. "Let's see who gets arrested." She blinked rapidly, momentarily thrown off by my confidence, but Karen wasn't one to back down. With a dramatic inhale, she turned away and started shouting into the phone, demanding immediate police action against my illegal aircraft. She had no idea who she was dealing with. My name is Daniel Carter, and I'm a U.S. Senator. I don't flaunt my position. I don't care for the spotlight when I'm off duty. That's why I chose this quiet, upscale neighborhood just outside the city, a place where I could enjoy some peace. Or at least, that was the plan. The Homeowners Association had other ideas. HOAs are notorious for their rules, but this one had something special. Karen. She wasn't just an HOA president. She was a fanatic, a control freak who believed every property was hers to govern. For the past 2 years, she had terrorized the neighborhood, issuing citations for the wrong shade of beige, mandating exact grass heights, and imposing fines for unauthorized decorations. When I bought my home, I made sure it was outside the HOA's jurisdiction. That didn't matter to Karen. In her mind, everything was under her rule. At first, I ignored her power trips, but then I installed my helicopter pad. It wasn't some backyard DIY project. It was fully licensed, FAA approved, and built with the proper permits. I needed it for my job. It saved me hours of travel time to Washington, D.C. But Karen hated it. The first time she saw it, she stormed onto my property like an outraged dictator. "This is absolutely unacceptable," she screeched. I had just stepped outside when she marched up my driveway, HOA rulebook in hand, like a priest clutching a Bible. "You can't just build an airstrip in a neighborhood." I leaned against my truck, arms crossed. "It's a helipad, not an airstrip." She waved a dismissive hand. "Same thing. It's loud, it's dangerous, and it violates HOA regulations." "Karen," I said, keeping my tone even, "I'm not in the HOA." She froze, her mouth slightly open. "What? My property isn't under HOA jurisdiction." It never was. She blinked, processing, then she straightened up and smirked. "Oh, we'll see about that." I watched as she spun on her heel and stomped away. Over the next week, I received 4 separate letters from the HOA. The first was a warning that my helicopter pad was in violation of community guidelines. The second was an official violation notice demanding its removal. The third was a $500 fine, and the fourth was a threat to escalate matters to law enforcement. Time I sent the same response, a copy of my property deed, clearly showing I was outside the HOA's control. I figured that would end it. I underestimated Karen. She was convinced that my helipad was her personal crusade. If the HOA couldn't control me, she would. She started spreading rumors. "I heard he's using it for illegal activity," she whispered to neighbors at the community pool. "I bet he doesn't have the right permits," she mused at the local bakery. "The noise," she lamented to anyone who would listen. "It's ruining our peaceful neighborhood." Then came the complaints. Noise complaints, safety complaints, zoning complaints. At first, they were subtle, the occasional grumble from a neighbor, a passive-aggressive email from the HOA. But as the days passed, Karen escalated. She cornered me outside my house one evening, her arms crossed tightly. "I've been more than patient with you," she said, her voice dripping with condescension. "But you need to remove that pad." I exhaled slowly. "Karen, I have every legal right to have it." She tilted her head, a nasty smirk on her lips. "We'll see what the city has to say." That's when the official city inspector showed up at my door. "Sorry to bother you, sir," he said, looking half apologetic. "We received multiple complaints about an unregistered helipad." I handed him my documents showing everything was up to code. He scanned through them, nodded, and let out a sigh. This is all legal. I know Karen's been calling us nonstop about this. I know, he shook his head. She's going to lose her mind when she finds out she wasted her time. I know, but Karen wasn't done. After the city inspector left, she took things up a notch. She waited until she heard my helicopter approaching one evening, then immediately dialed 911. There's an unauthorized aircraft landing in my neighborhood, she shrieked into the phone. The dispatcher tried to calm her down, asking if it was an actual emergency. Yes, it's an illegal landing strip. What's the emergency, ma'am? It's lowering our property values. I wish I could have seen the dispatcher's face the moment my helicopter landed. I saw Karen standing on the sidewalk, gripping her phone like a weapon, her eyes filled with unhinged satisfaction. Within minutes, a police car pulled up, lights flashing. Two officers stepped out. Karen practically ran to them, arms flailing. Arrest him. He's flying illegally. The officers exchanged a glance, then they turned to me. Sir, we received a report about an unauthorized airstrip. I nodded, pulled out my wallet, and handed them my FAA authorization, my permits, and one more thing, my Senate ID. One officer took a breath and exhaled sharply. Ma'am, he said, his voice suddenly very tired. This helipad is completely legal. Karen's eyes widened. But. Also, he added, holding up a notepad, filing false reports to emergency services is a crime. Karen's mouth flapped like a fish gasping for air. I allowed myself a small, satisfied smile. She had played her hand, and she had lost. The question was, would she back down, or was she about to make an even bigger mistake? The police officers had barely left my driveway when Karen stormed off, her face twisted in pure rage. I could practically see the steam coming out her ears. For a moment, I thought that might be the end of it. Surely, after being humiliated in front of the police, she'd retreat and lick her wounds, realizing she had lost this battle. I was wrong. Karen wasn't just a sore loser. She was a fanatic, and she was about to escalate things in a way I hadn't expected. The next morning, a notice appeared on my front door. Final warning, violation of community standards. I pulled the paper off the door and skimmed through the ridiculous claims. Unauthorized aircraft use, noise pollution violation, endangerment of neighborhood safety, failure to comply with HOA regulations. The last one made me chuckle. Still pretending the HOA controls my property. Huh, Karen? I crumpled the notice and tossed it into the trash. Moments later, my phone buzzed. It was an unknown number. Against my better judgment, I picked up. Mr. Carter, this is Greg Dawson from the HOA Legal Committee, a smug voice said. I sighed. Let me guess, you're calling about the helipad? You're violating several HOA guidelines. I cut him off. I'm not in the HOA. There was a pause. Then Greg cleared his throat. That may be technically true, but the spirit of the community requires all homeowners to adhere to goodbye, Greg. I hung up. Not 5 minutes later, I heard Karen outside, ranting to a few other HOA board members. He thinks he's above the rules, but this isn't over. I watched from my window as she waved around a folder, her face animated with rage. Karen wasn't just mad. She was on a mission. That week, the HOA board went into overdrive, launching what I could only describe as a full-scale legal assault. First came the fines. They tried slapping me with $1,000 for community disruption. Then the daily harassment. Karen and her cronies began knocking on my door every day, leaving letters filled with vague legal threats. False complaints flooded the city office. Noise complaints, zoning violations, environmental concerns, anything to try and make my life hell. But I had time, money, and the law on my side. Every fine was unenforceable, every letter irrelevant, every complaint dismissed. But then Karen pulled a dirty trick. One morning, I woke up to the sound of construction work. I stepped outside and nearly laughed. Karen had ordered a massive HOA fence to be built directly across my driveway entrance. A few confused construction workers were already digging holes, preparing to set up wooden posts. Whoa. What the hell is this? I called out, walking up to them. One of the workers, a guy in an orange vest, looked up from his clipboard. You're Mr. Carter, right? Yeah. We're putting up an HOA privacy fence. They said you're in violation of community standards and that this fence was approved by the board. I stared at him incredulous. They can't build this here. He shrugged. I don't know, man. We just follow orders. A loud clap echoed behind me. I turned to see Karen standing smugly on the sidewalk, like my new project. She sneered. We decided this section of the neighborhood needs more privacy. I chuckled, shaking my head. You do realize this is illegal, right? Karen tilted her head. Oh well, we'll see what the county says. I smirked. We sure will. Instead of arguing, I made one phone call. A few hours later, a county inspector rolled up in a white truck. He was a gruff-looking man in his 50s, the kind who had zero patience for HOA nonsense. After about 5 minutes of looking at the work permits, the inspector walked up to Karen, arms crossed. Ma'am, you cannot build a fence blocking a legally registered driveway. Karen's confident smile wavered. But we voted on it. The inspector didn't blink. I don't care if the Pope himself voted on it. You can't obstruct someone's property. Remove it. Karen's face twisted in fury. That's not fair. The inspector exhaled sharply, clearly done with her. Lady, if you don't take it down, I'll have the county fine you personally for an illegal structure. Karen was fuming, but she had no choice. By the next morning, the fence was gone. Karen should have stopped there, but her ego wouldn't let her. She started trying to recruit the neighbors. At first, it was just whispers, he's ruining the neighborhood. Then I got actual letters from people claiming to be concerned citizens. We don't think helicopters belong in a peaceful neighborhood. Your actions are dividing the community. Maybe you should consider moving. The thing was, most of the neighbors didn't care. Sure, a few of them bought into Karen's paranoia, but plenty of others were just living their lives, ignoring the drama. And some, they loved the show. One afternoon, as I was checking my mail, my next-door neighbor Jack walked up to me with a grin. Man, I love what you're doing, he chuckled. I raised an eyebrow. What? You're making Karen go nuts. I've lived here for 10 years, and no one's ever stood up to her like this. I smirked, glad someone's enjoying the circus. Oh dude, the whole street is enjoying it. Apparently, my ongoing war with Karen had turned into prime entertainment. But Karen, she thought she was winning, and she was about to pull her craziest move yet. The next day, she called in the Federal Aviation Administration. I was sitting in my backyard when I saw a white SUV pull up, marked with FAA on the side. Two men in suits stepped out carrying clipboards. I sighed. Here we go again. Karen stood smugly at the edge of my property, arms crossed. Good luck explaining this one, she said, grinning. I exhaled, cracking my neck. She was playing with fire now, because what she didn't know was that her own illegal backyard modifications were about to get her in trouble. I was sipping my morning coffee, watching the sun rise over my perfectly legal helipad when I heard it. Yes, officer, it's a serious crime. You need to get here immediately. Karen's shrill voice echoed through the neighborhood. I turned my head and saw her standing in her front yard. Hone pressed tightly to her ear, pacing in furious little circles. I sighed. What now? Within minutes, I got my answer. A police cruiser rolled into the neighborhood, lights flashing. Two officers stepped out, looking mildly confused. Karen rushed toward them, waving her hands like she had just witnessed a bank robbery. There, she screeched, pointing at my helipad like she had caught me running a criminal empire. He's operating an illegal airstrip in a residential area. One of the officers, a middle-aged man with tired eyes, rubbed his temple. Ma'am, he sighed, can you explain what exactly is illegal here? Karen gasped dramatically, as if personally offended by his question. The airstrip. He's bringing an unauthorized aircraft. It's a threat to our safety. The younger officer glanced over at me. I stood casually by my porch, coffee mug in hand, watching the disaster unfold. Sir, he said, walking toward me. Is this your property? It is, I said, setting my mug down. And I assume Karen here told you I'm violating some law. She claims you have an unlicensed airstrip. I pulled out my wallet and handed over a neatly folded packet of papers. FAA-approved helipad, fully permitted, legally registered. Would you like to see my Senate ID as well? The officer blinked. Wait, Senate. I nodded, handing over my identification. Daniel Carter, U.S. Senator. The officer's eyes widened slightly as he scanned my credentials. His partner, still dealing with Karen's rambling, glanced over. The older officer turned back to her. "Ma'am," he said, already exhausted, "this man is a U.S. senator, and this helipad is legal." Karen's mouth flapped open and shut like a fish gasping for air. But it's not safe." The officer sighed. "Ma'am, you can't just call 911 over things you personally don't like. Do you realize this is a misuse of emergency services?" Karen's expression twisted. "I am a taxpayer," she shrieked. "Ma'am, that's not how this works." The younger officer turned back to me. "Senator, I apologize for the inconvenience." "No worries," I said with a small smirk. "Karen here has been harassing me over this for weeks." Karen gasped, pointing a trembling finger at me. "He's lying." The officer held up a hand, cutting her off. "Ma'am, do you have any actual evidence that he's breaking the law?" She sputtered. "It's common sense." The older officer exhaled, clearly at the end of his patience. "Ma'am, if you continue filing false reports, you could be charged with misuse of emergency services." Karen turned pale. What? I was just, consider this a warning," the officer continued. "If we get another call like this, there will be consequences." Karen clenched her fists. Her jaw worked furiously like she wanted to keep arguing, but she wasn't stupid enough to risk an actual charge. Not yet, at least. With one final huff, she stomped back toward her house, practically vibrating with rage. The officers handed my documents back. "You're good to go, Senator," the younger one said. "Sorry again for the trouble." "No problem." I watched as they drove off, wondering if that was finally the end. At the end of Karen's war, I should have known better. That night, I heard a loud bang from outside. I stepped onto my porch and stared. Someone had dumped a pile of trash on my helipad. Karen stood smugly by her yard, watching me with crossed arms. I exhaled sharply. All right, now it's getting petty. The next morning, I had it all cleaned up before my next flight. Later that afternoon, Karen struck again. I came back from work to find a homemade noise pollution sign stuck in my lawn. I didn't even acknowledge it. I just removed it and tossed in the trash. Then came the petition. Karen started going door to door, try to get neighbors to sign a complaint against me. One evening, I heard her knocking on my next-door neighbor Jack's door. Jack, the same guy who had told me how much he loved watching Karen lose her mind, opened the door. "Hey, Karen," he said, barely hiding his amusement. "I'm collecting signatures to remove that menace of a helipad before it ruins our neighborhood." Jack paused for a long moment, then he said, "Oh, wow. Karen, you're totally right. My kids love watching the helicopter land, but now that I think about it, it's definitely a menace." Karen beamed. "Exactly." Jack cleared his throat. "But you know what's worse?" Karen blinked. Jack lowered his voice dramatically. "Asha, sit so." Then he slammed the door in her face. I nearly choked laughing when he told me later. Karen was desperate now. She had tried the legal route, the harassment, the social pressure, and even 911. Nothing had worked, so she took it up a level. She called the FAA. I was sitting in my backyard when I saw another government vehicle roll up. Two men in suits stepped out. Their jackets had Federal Aviation Administration embroidered on them. Karen stood on the sidewalk, arms crossed, looking smugger than ever. I sighed. One of the agents walked up. "Mr. Carter?" "That's me," I said. He nodded. "We received a complaint about unauthorized aircraft operations." I glanced at Karen. "Let me guess, she called you?" Karen puffed out her chest. "Finally, someone who understands how serious this is." The agent looked unimpressed. He turned back to me. "Can we see your permits?" I nodded, already pulling out the paperwork. "Here you go, all FAA approved." He flipped through the pages, scanning the documents. After a few minutes, he looked back up. "This is all legal." I smiled. "I know." Karen froze. What?" The agent turned to her. "Ma'am, this helipad is federally authorized. There is no violation here." Karen's face turned bright red. "But it's ruining the neighborhood." The agent sighed. "Wasting government resources on false complaints is a serious offense." Karen's smugness shattered. "You mean I could get in trouble?" The agent nodded. "Yes, and if you continue filing false reports, you will be fined." Karen was speechless. For the first time ever, she had nothing to say. I crossed my arms, enjoying the moment. You done yet, Karen? I asked, tilting my head. Her lips pressed into a thin line. Then, with one final glare, she stomped back into her house and slammed the door. The agent shook his head. We get one of these every year, I chuckled. She won't stop, you know. The agent sighed. Probably not. And I was right, because Karen's biggest mistake was yet to come. I thought Karen had finally hit rock bottom after the FAA agent shut her down, but if there was one thing I had learned about her, it was that she never knew when to quit. Her campaign of tyranny had been humiliated at every turn. Police dismissed her, the city inspector shut down her illegal fence, and now the FAA had told her in no uncertain terms that my helipad was completely legal. Any sane person would have backed off. Karen was not sane. Instead of giving up, she doubled down. The next morning, I received an official-looking envelope in the mail. FAA investigation notice. I frowned, tearing it open. The letter was full of bureaucratic jargon, but the gist of it was simple. Someone had filed a formal complaint against me, claiming I was engaging in illegal air traffic operations. The FAA was forced to investigate due to the nature of the complaint. A full review of my flight logs, permits, and safety compliance was being initiated. I sighed, pinching the bridge of my nose. Karen had somehow managed to escalate this to a federal level. This wasn't just an annoying HOA dispute anymore. This was a full-scale government-level nuisance. I made a few calls, sent over the necessary documents, and scheduled an appointment with the FAA review team. The process was straightforward but time-consuming. I had to submit. Heavy check mark my FAA-approved helipad documentation. Heavy check mark my personal flight log. Heavy check mark my aircraft's registration details. Heavy check mark proof of compliance with noise ordinances and safety regulations. It was all in order, of course, but the fact that I even had to go through this at all was infuriating. Karen wasn't just wasting my time. She was wasting the time of federal investigators over a personal vendetta. A week later, 2 FAA officials showed up at my house again, this time with a full investigation team. Karen was watching from her window, peeking through her blinds like a nosy villain in a soap opera. I greeted the agents at my front door. "Gentlemen, welcome back. Let me guess, you're here because of her." One of the agents, a no-nonsense guy named Agent Turner, sighed. "Yeah, we received a formal FAA complaint that we had to investigate." I smirked. "I assume you already know it's nonsense." The second agent, Agent Patel, nodded. "Your paperwork checked out, but since it's a formal review, we have to go through the motions." I waved them inside. "Go ahead, whatever you need." For the next hour, they reviewed my documents, inspected my aircraft, and checked the helipad's measurements. Everything was perfectly legal. Agent Turner rubbed his temples. "This is an absolute waste of time." I gestured toward Karen's house. "She thinks she owns the entire neighborhood. This is what she does." Agent Patel exhaled sharply. "We get these kinds of people every once in a while." Tyrants who think they're above actual law. Then he checked something on his tablet and frowned. "Hold on," he muttered. I raised an eyebrow. Patel looked up. "There's a flag violation on your street." I blinked. "My street? Not my property." "Correct," he said, scrolling through the records. "Apparently, another complaint was made about illegal structures, but it wasn't directed at you." I suddenly had a hunch. "Give me a name," I said. Patel glanced at Turner, then back at his tablet. After a few seconds, he smirked. "Karen Whitmore." I burst out laughing. The FAA had found something Karen didn't expect. Turns out, when she filed the complaint against me, her own property got flagged for an entirely separate violation. Agent Patel flipped his tablet around, showing me the aerial image. Karen's backyard was an absolute mess. She had built an oversized shed without a permit, extended her fence beyond zoning limits, and the best part, she had installed an unauthorized amateur radio tower, which violated FAA height restrictions. I grinned. "So let me get this straight. She called you guys on me, but her own property is in violation?" Agent Turner smirked. "Oh, it's much worse than that." He pulled up another document. "She's been warned 3 times before about her unauthorized radio tower. She ignored every notice." My grin widened. "So what happens now?" I asked. Agent Patel crossed his arms. If she doesn't take it down voluntarily, she gets fined thousands of dollars for violating FAA regulations. I chuckled. And if she refuses? Turner smirked. Then we escalate to legal action. And if it reaches that point, she could be forced to remove it at her own expense. I glanced at Karen's house, imagining the sheer rage she was about to feel when she realized her plan had backfired spectacularly. The FAA agents left a formal notice on Karen's door before they departed. Not 5 minutes later, her front door flew open, and she snatched the letter off her porch. I watched from my yard as she read it, her face turning a deeper shade of red with each passing second. Then she snapped. She stormed over to me, waving the notice in my face. "You did this," she shrieked. I sipped my coffee. "Nope, you did this. You called the FAA on me, and they found your violations." She tore the paper in half, grinding her teeth. I'm calling my lawyer." I shrugged. "Good luck with that." She stormed back to her house, slamming her door so hard it rattled the windows. The best part? A week later, her radio tower was gone. Not by her choice, of course. She had fought tooth and nail, screaming at the inspectors, threatening lawsuits, and even trying to start a GoFundMe for victims. It failed miserably. In the end, she had no choice but to tear down her precious tower. And the cherry on top? The FAA slapped her with a $110,000 fine for repeatedly ignoring their warnings. Karen had tried to take me down with federal complaints. Instead, she had destroyed herself. I couldn't have planned it better if I tried. But even that wasn't the end, because now the neighbors were turning against her, and soon Karen would face her ultimate downfall. Karen had spent weeks trying to get rid of my helipad. She had called the police, harassed the city inspector, filed false reports with the FAA, and even illegally built a fence across my driveway. Every single time she had been humiliated, but nothing compared to this latest failure. She had tried to sick the federal government on me, only to get caught in her own trap. The FAA had fined her, forced her to tear down her illegal radio tower, and publicly exposed her as a repeat zoning violator. And the best part? Everyone knew about it. The internet strikes back. It all started with a single post in the neighborhood's online forum. HOA president fails to take down helicopter, ends up fined by the FAA instead. Someone, probably one of the neighbors sick of Karen, had leaked the entire saga online. Within hours, it spread like wildfire. Screenshots of Karen's screaming HOA emails were posted in the comments. People shared memes comparing her to a dictator. Some genius even photoshopped a picture of her next to a no-fly zone sign, looking furious. By the next morning, the post had hundreds of comments. "Wait, she tried to report a senator to the FAA? LOL. How dumb can you be, Karen? I'll destroy him." Reality, she destroys herself instead. The real crime here is her haircut. Karen's HOA empire was collapsing, not because of me, but because her own neighbors were turning against her. The HOA board rebelled. That week, the HOA had a special emergency meeting. Karen called it, thinking she would rally the board to her side. She was in for a shock. By now, even her most loyal supporters had realized she was a walking disaster. The board members sat stiffly as Karen ranted and raved about my illegal helipad, about the FAA's unfair treatment of her, about how the neighborhood was falling into chaos. Finally, one of the board members, Greg Dawson, the legal advisor, cleared his throat. "Karen," he said slowly, "you do understand that the FAA isn't some local code enforcement group, right? They regulate actual airspace laws." Karen's nostrils flared. "So what? This is our community. We make the rules." Another board member, Linda, sighed. "No, Karen, that's not how any of this works." Karen looked around, realizing no one was supporting her. That's when Greg dropped the hammer. "We need to talk about your violations, Karen." "What?" Linda slid a folder across the table. "It turns out," she said, "that you have been ignoring multiple zoning violations for years." Karen's hands trembled as she flipped through the documents. "Illegal backyard extensions," Greg continued, "unregistered modifications to your home, and let's not forget the $10,000 FAA fine." Karen snapped. "This is a witch hunt," she screeched. "HEK behind this? HEK turning you all against me? I wasn't even at the meeting." Linda shook her head. Karen, we're done. The HOA is removing you as president. Karen froze. For the first time ever, she looked genuinely shocked. Why? You can't do that, she whispered. Greg exhaled. Actually, we held a vote before this meeting. You've been officially removed from the HOA board. Karen's face twisted into a look of pure betrayal. You can't do this to me, she shrieked, but no one was listening anymore. She had lost the ultimate karma. That weekend, a for sale sign appeared on Karen's lawn. I nearly choked on my coffee when I saw it. The once all-powerful HOA queen had been run out of her own kingdom. The funniest part? She couldn't even sell her house easily because her property value actually dropped. Not because of my helipad. No, it dropped because no one wanted to live near her. I was outside when my neighbor Jack walked over grinning. You see it? He asked, nodding toward the sign. Oh, I saw it. I chuckled. Think she'll leave quietly? Jack snorted. Not a chance. And he was right. Karen's final meltdown lasted for weeks. She tried to fight it. She ran it on Facebook, screamed at realtors, and even tried to sue the HOA, claiming she had been illegally removed. The lawsuit got thrown out instantly. Desperate, Karen tried to start a petition to get reinstated. Only one person signed it, herself. Finally, after months of humiliation, she packed up her things and moved on. The day she left, I happened to be outside polishing my helicopter. Karen glared at me from her driveway, her eyes burning with pure hatred. Safe travels, Karen. I called. She made a noise that sounded like a dying raccoon, then jumped in her car and sped off. That was the last I ever saw of her. The neighborhood's victory lap. With Karen gone, the neighborhood finally relaxed. The HOA, now under reasonable leadership, actually started doing things that help people. They lowered the ridiculous HOA fines, stopped micromanaging everyone's property, and best of all, they never brought up my helipad again. Jack stopped by one evening, handing me a beer. Man, he said, shaking his head, that was the greatest HOA meltdown I've ever seen.